have 25 slaves working for me. Now, I'm not some kind of slave driver with a whip. I don't own a plantation or run some kind of sweatshop. I'm just a college student, too caught up in my own experience to realize that the decisions that I make about the things that I buy have repercussions across the world. According to a survey from slaveryfootprint.org, the things that I buy and the things that I wear are enough to keep 25 slaves in forced labor. Slavery across the world may be a difficult thing to really grasp or get a proper perspective about, but it might help to understand that slavery is still alive and well in the United States today. The issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation may have removed more obvious forms of slavery, but the practice remains in existence, more subtle in appearance, taking the form of sex trafficking and labor exploitation, yet just as atrocious and more accessible. According to the Freedom Project, purchasing a slave 200 years ago averaged a cost of what is today's equivalent of $40,000. Today, that average cost is $90. Furthermore, the 2013 Congressional Research Service report estimates that up to 100,000 children may be currently victimized by human trafficking, and up to 17,500 slaves are brought across our borders every year by traffickers. In light of the disturbing reports that slavery not only still exists today, but is very much prevalent, it is important to understand what we mean when we call something slavery. And it's also important to determine how we have continued to encourage its practice. And finally, examine what actions are being taken in politics today to eliminate the practice of slavery in the United States. While we may think that we understand what slavery is, most of us probably still picture workers in chains being marched off of slave ships to work long hours under the hot sun without payment as they're beaten and whipped. However, a slave is now defined by the Freedom Center to include any victim induced into exploitation through fraud, force, or coercion, subjected to physical abuse or psychological intimidation, with no ability to readily free themselves from their current situation. The most common forms of modern slavery are sexual exploitation and labor coercion. Foreigners are drawn to the United States by traffickers under the pretenses of freedom and quality of life, yet find themselves forced to work for free, for hardly any wages, and are left in a financial bondage to the very same ones who had promised them freedom. Furthermore, young girls are either kidnapped into sexual slavery or lured by pimps with the promises of love and attention, and then kept in forced prostitution by physical and psychological abuse. Linda Funt, a former victim of sexual slavery and now an activist against trafficking, states, in the dictionary, the definition of slavery is the state of someone bound in servitude. If someone sells you to someone else, is that not slavery? If someone forces you to do things against your will and you're not allowed to leave, is that not slavery? Then I ask you why. When pimps traffic young women and girls on the streets of America, is this not a form of modern-day slavery? With the understanding of how slavery still exists in our free country today, it is important then to determine how such acts continue to occur. According to the Freedom Center, modern-day slavery is commonly associated with poverty, and that socioeconomic status plays a role in one's susceptibility as a victim of human trafficking. However, victims of trafficking are also often too afraid to seek help, allowing atrocities to continue unnoticed and unpunished. The National Institute of Justice, or NIJ, explains that even victims identified by law enforcement officials as suspected victims of forced prostitution and sexual exploitation rarely cooperate in investigations because of their fear of their captors. Captives also retain a certain level of loyalty to their captors because of dependencies as a result of psychological abuse or general hopelessness of discovering any alternative to support themselves or their children. The National Institute of Justice also points out that victims who are foreigners are especially unlikely to seek help from their plight due to language barriers, as well as a distrust or fear of law enforcement because of their immigration status. Furthermore, because slavery today is more subtle in nature, their perpetrators of both labor and sex trafficking are difficult to identify by law enforcement. Investigators often prosecute perpetrators for alternative crimes, such as violence or rape, because they are unfamiliar with prosecution procedures of human trafficking, and it is easier to convict a criminal of more familiar offenses. While this still grants that traffickers will be punished, the improper categorization of their crimes decreases the statistical data available for the prevalence of human trafficking, and thus diminishes the allocation of resources to fight trafficking properly. Within the last 15 years, however, the existence of slavery in our country has received much more political attention, and our country is moving in a direction to truly eradicate slavery as it tried to 150 years ago. In 2000, the TVPA, which stands for the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, was passed to fight human trafficking using what the bill identifies as a three-pronged approach. According to the Polaris Project Summary of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, the first three of these prongs is the prevention of trafficking crimes and victimization through the institution of public awareness as well as monitoring programs. The second strategy is protection through services to foreign national victims. Finally, the last approach is prosecution. Through the redefining of human trafficking as a federal crime, prosecution has become easier for law enforcement. Since the passing of the Act 13 years ago, the TVPA has been revised several times to increase the effectiveness of the bill. In 2003, revisions required the Attorney General to submit an annual report to Congress about steps taken to combat trafficking. In 2005, $300 million were allotted over 2 years to fight human trafficking. In 2008, revisions increased the penalties for financially benefiting from human trafficking crimes, required the Department of Justice to create new trafficking investigation models, and authorized a new program that would provide services to survivors of trafficking. And finally, on March 7, 2013, a reauthorization of the TVPA was signed by President Obama, enhancing state and local government collaboration to improve the efficiency of the human trafficking investigation. While slavery is thought to be an issue of the past, it is disturbing to realize that it is still a very real issue in such a developed nation as ours. And while we are still in our infancy with respect to attacking these newly defined forms of slavery, it is comforting that our country has taken such a hard stand against fighting and making steps to attack it. Are there any questions?
Why did you pick that topic?
Well, it was honestly recommended to me by a friend, but I thought it was a great topic because about a year ago, one of the ministries I'm involved in at A&M did a fundraiser for human trafficking internationally, not nationally. But I had no idea about how prevalent human trafficking was around the world, and it really hit me really hard realizing that. And so I thought other people should know that it's still here in the U.S. too. So.
Well, do you think there's a kind of there's an age limit for those that are actually involved, or is it kind of gender oriented? Is it tilted towards female human trafficking or male human trafficking, or
like for victims?
Yes, for the victims.
Yeah, it is. As far as sex trafficking, there definitely are male victims. The female victims are more prevalent. And as far as age goes, I found some statistics while I was doing some research about children being enslaved as young as 9 years old, and those statistics were about females. But yeah, so very, very young.